Hi, welcome back to Mistake Man. This is going to be part 2 of my Defiant build video. And at this point, got the two halves glued together, and there are major gaps and stuff in these seams. And so the next step is to try and fill those in, clean them up, smooth them out as much as I can. This is a process that I'm not good at. I don't have a lot of experience doing this with my models. And so this is very much going to be a learning process for me. Um, Learning what the right tools will be to make sure I get good results, what the right techniques will be, and yeah, so I'm going to be learning a lot along the way. Um, One of the challenges that I have, in addition to just making the seams look good, is that there's also some light leaks in the seams. And let me hook that up so you can see what I mean. I've shut off the room lights and the overhead lights. All there really is some daylight coming in through the, the blinds that are closed. But I think it's still good enough to be able to see what I'm talking about along those seams. There's definitely some light leaking out from the interior lighting, and most of that is from the way that I set up the lighting for these windows. Was obviously I just drilled some holes in the hull, and then I put in some little cob strips of LEDs in a couple places, um, two on the port side and two on the starboard side. And they're just blasting their light all around inside of the model. The inside surface of the model is painted white, so a lot of that light can reflect around and make its way out where it needs to, which is, of course, the windows. And then these features on the top are lit by that as well. There's a lot of light bouncing around inside of there, and some of it is obviously going to make its way out through the cracks. And so this gap here is huge. I'm going to have to fill that with probably some additional plastic. But then there's other spots where there's just a tiny bit of a gap where I can put some putty in there to block it off. And then there's other spots like these, which actually show up more on camera than they do in person, where there's not as much of a gap there as there just is some light that's shining through thin spots in the plastic. Or in this case, where I don't think the plastic is actually closed up completely when I glued it together, but there is still glue that's in there that's, bonding the two halves together, and the light is just coming through that little seam of glue right there. You can really see it on this side there. So there's not actually a gap there. It's just there's some glue that's come through. So this one in person is really dim. It's showing up a lot brighter on camera than it is in person. As you can see, I've already masked off the warp nacelle cavities because they just had that photo etch grill over them, and I'm going to be sanding putty and scraping putty out of panel lines and things and creating a lot of dust, and I don't want it to get down in there because it's going to be really difficult to clean that out of there. So yeah, let's get this process started. I have already started trying to fill in this joint right here. This seemed to be like the easiest one to maybe mitigate, to fix. So I started with this one, and I've just been putting a little bit of putty along here and trying to smooth it out. Some of the panel lines I'm going to still have to, the ones that actually cross the seam, I'm going to have to clean out at some point, but I'm not ready to do that yet. I'm not sure I like the finished smoothness so far, and it's a challenge to see if it's actually going to be smooth once I get a coat of paint over that, or if that seam is still going to just stick out like a sore thumb. I don't think it's quite there yet. I need to do a little bit more work on that. But as a test, I wasn't sure if just the putty was going to be good enough to block the light that was coming through the seam. I went ahead and put it on there and tried it, and let me show you what that looks like. Here it is. You can see that there's a lot of light still coming through there. Definitely shows up worse on camera than it does in person, but it's still noticeable in person. I don't know if I'm satisfied with that. I don't think just putting the putty on there is going to be good enough, because I think once I get coats of paint on there, you're still going to be able to see that light coming through. So might have to try something else with the light blocking black paint before I do the putty work on that. Okay, so I tried with some black paint on the opposite side, and just ran some black paint along that seam. And this is just your regular acrylic craft paint, black, not like the thick t-shirt paint, but because I don't really need the thickness at this point. I just actually having it thinner to be able to run down into whatever crack there is helpful. As you can see, there's still quite a bit of light coming through around that seam, so I might have to spread the black paint out just a little bit to see if that helps enough. I have not done any puttying on this side, so I haven't been too careful about, actually covering up the seams, just getting the black paint in there to block the light, and then I'll go back over it with some putty and try and smooth it out as best I can. All right, here's that edge that I just added some black paint to in the light. So basically just ran black paint just inside the seam, not really too much around it, but I think I might have to spread some paint around it just a little bit to see if it blocks any more of that light that seems to be coming in through the plastic itself. So I'll try and do that, but I don't want to get too messy with it. Obviously I'm going to be putting a base coat and several other coats of paint on top of that. And so, yeah, I just don't want it to look too sloppy after it's done being painted. I'm not too good at filling in seams and smoothing them out to make them disappear. That's not a skill I've really developed at this point. So you're going to actually be watching me develop that skill as I work my way through this. I've laid out some tools that might help me get through this process as I try and figure out what's going on. Star of the show, of course, is the putty. I'm using this perfect plastic putty. From what little I've done so far, this has been the easiest to work with because it's water soluble, which makes it really easy to just kind of rub things up, put a little bit of water on my finger and kind of smooth things out with my finger that way. And it does dry quickly like every other putty I've worked with, but it's easy to just kind of get it back to being pliable by putting a little bit of water on it. So definitely the easiest to work with that I've done so far. So I'm just going to get started putting some putty on and see where we go from here. So I've done a little bit of work to the seam. I had the little bit of black paint that I showed you on there, but there were a couple of spots where the light was still coming through the plastic, and I wanted to maybe just try and block that off a little bit. So I just got a paintbrush and got some of this regular black acrylic craft paint. Same stuff as I had first run through that little seam, but I just kind of brushed it over the plastic in just two light coats, and that cut down the light that was coming through to a point that I'm satisfied that once I've got all the putty on and all the coats of finished paint on there, I don't think there's going to be any light coming through. So I think that's going to work. I've also gone through here and put a bunch of putty in, and it's obviously really, really gobby and rough at this point, but that's okay. I'm letting it dry a little bit before I start working with it, and then I'm just going to go over and try and start smoothing it. And since this stuff is water-based, I don't have to even use sandpaper to do that. I can use the cotton swabs, dip them in some water, and then just run them across the paper towel just to get any excess water out, so they're just damp. And then just kind of run along and rub. It's still not. I mean, it's not completely dry by any means. It's only been a few minutes since I put that putty on there, so it's still able to be smoothed out pretty easily. Um, So that's one technique I've been using, but I also just find it easier to get better control and more coverage to just use the tip of my gloved finger. So I'll just kind of dip that, get a drop of water on there, and run it across these two fingers, and then just kind of see how it just like instantly starts smoothing that. And then go back in for more water if I need to. Dab it on a towel if it's too much. And I'm really using very little water. You want to be sparing here because you don't want to just completely wash the stuff away. I mean, you can always add more, but it's just a pain to have to keep redoing it. Take too much off. So, I mean, the finish you get from doing this is still pretty rough. So I might have to go over this a few times. I mean, I might end up taking too much off, then have to put another layer on, and then just, I don't know. Like I said, I'm not good at this process. I'm not sure what the best techniques are. Just kind of learning as I go. And I honestly don't get the best results, so I know there's improvement to be made. But uh, anyway, that's kind of the process I'm working with. Obviously, this it fills in the panel lines that I want to keep, so I'll have to go back and scrape those out later. But it's definitely filling in that seam. There were a few spots where if there was too big of an overhang or a step from one side of the seam to the other, that I went through with some sandpaper on a little sanding stick and just went through and tried to smooth those out. I don't want to do too much of that. It's always a balance of removing material versus adding putty, or maybe a combination, something in between, to get the seams to look good in the end. I've smoothed out that section of putty, that line of putty that I ran along that seam there, and I think it's starting to look decent. Um, Still, I think I might need to do another layer of the putty and another round of smoothing to get that more even than it is now. And as I did that, I removed most of that paint that I had painted beyond the lines. You know, dipping my finger in the water and rubbing that putty. Obviously, the paint is water based as well, so it mostly came off. I think it's still worth putting the paint on the actual seam itself first because most of that has managed to stay, and any of the spots that are underneath the putty are essentially untouched. So, but it's not really worth doing the extra paint beyond the seams at this stage. It'll be better to do that, you know, after I've puttied it, or maybe even after I've put, you know, if I'm going to do another coat of primer. I haven't decided if I'm going to do that yet, um, but that can certainly come later before I put the base coat of paint of the actual hull color on. So anyway, that seam is looking a little bit better. So I kind of started going around to some of these other seams and just maybe doing a little bit of sanding. And oh man, I've got my work cut out for me on some of these other seams. These ones on the nacelles are probably going to be the easiest to work with, but some of these others, you can see there's a huge step in that seam right there. That's just, oof, that's bad. There's a big gap there, large gaps in some of the other spots. So, yep, definitely got my work cut out for me. And I've started going through and adding some more light blocking to some of the other areas where there was some light leaking out. There's still a few more spots, like here in the back. Yeah, when I turn the lights off, you'll see those. And then I've done a little bit around the impulse engines as well, but I might need to do some more there. And then there's definitely a lot that needs to happen down in there. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. But let me show you kind of what I've settled on and what's working for me here. I decided to go ahead and pull out just a syringe with one of these blunt needles on the end that's just like a tube that's big enough to allow the paint to pass through, but not too big that I can't fill some of the small holes and gaps that I've got. And so I just put that on there. And so I put some on the tape here, and then just stuck the syringe in and tried to suck some of that up, and that didn't work very well. It just mostly sucked up air. So I figured the better method is actually just to take the plunger out, and then we'll just squirt some of this stuff directly in. Much less messy, will probably work better. So let's just try and get it all the way down there at the bottom. it's, it's all gonna pile up right there. That's okay. That's what the plunger's for. Okay, that's probably good enough for now. Okay, look at that. Wow, that plunger works great. There's no black paint left behind. Okay. Slowly pushing the air out. There we go. All right, so let me turn the lights off and turn the overhead lights off and get the model lighting turned on. Okay, I think there's still going to be plenty of light there for you to see what I'm doing. This one's going to need, that's a big gap. A lot of light coming through there. Definitely going to be using the thick fabric paint on that, so it stays in place, doesn't just run down the inside. I still need to be careful not to put too much because the light for this deflector housing is right there. It's right underneath this. Alright, so this is going to be tricky. Man, that is a big gap. Yeah, that's a pretty big gap. I'm not comfortable with just filling that with the paint. I don't think it'll hold up. I think I'm going to put a piece of plastic in there. I'll have to figure out exactly what'll work, but a piece of sprue, a piece of sheet styrene or something. But just in that corner where it really gets wide. Right here, I think I'll be fine with the fabric paint. So let's give that a try. It's tricky to get the right. I don't know exactly how much I'm actually injecting, if that's the word. Because I just kind of have to go by feel. How much I'm pushing with my finger to push on the plunger. Okay. A lot about that is just kind of squishing back out. Okay, we'll try the cleanup on this, see how it looks. Okay. Now that light blocking worked really well. I don't see any leaks. All right. Done some clean up on that, cleaned up any large blobs or ridges of paint. So let's test the light blocking on that. Turned off all the lights in here now except for what's coming from the ship, and it's nighttime, so there's no daylight coming through the blinds. So yeah, that looks, wow, that's great. I don't see any light leaks where I put that paint. All that's left is that one corner that I'm going to put some plastic in. All right, so I put in some plastic down into that corner there. You can kind of see I just broke off a piece of sheet styrene, about a 90-degree bend, and then it just slid right down into there. It almost slid too far and fell into the inside of the model, which would have really sucked because then I would have had a rattly thing bouncing around inside of my model for the rest of its existence. But I did manage to stop pushing just in time. And then I was concerned, well, maybe I should have put glue on that first, but there's no way I was going to get that back out of there without it falling in. So anyway, so I just used, like I said, some of this, just some scraps of sheet styrene that I had. But that'll give me a nice foundation that I can feel comfortable putting that thicker fabric paint over that to finish light blocking and not worry that it's ever going to just crumble and fall away and leave a gap there. So I've got a bit of a gap here where it's larger down at the bottom and then it tapers in a bit as it goes up here. So I want to kind of fill that in. I think I'm not going to completely erase that line because I think it'll look fine as kind of a panel line once it's done, but I do need to fill it in because there's light coming through that and there's a noticeable gap there. So I'm going to put some plastic behind it to help fill that in. And what I've got is just some scraps of sheet styrene, just scraps from some other projects. This is just like a tiny little strip of it. And this is from, I just kind of got like a variety pack, an assortment, if you will, of sheet styrene. And this is not the thinnest stuff, but it's the 0.02. So the 20 thousandths of an inch is what that is. So I've just got a strip that I've cut off and it fits pretty snugly, nicely in that bottom portion there. Kind of see it fits in there. But as it tapers, as the gap tapers narrower, the farther up it goes, this won't fit anymore. So I think what I'll probably do is I'll just take this little strip that I've got and I'll sand one end of it and just sand it less and less as I go up, so it'll put a bit of a taper on it and try my best to sort of match how long that is. So just try and fill that in as much as I can with some plastic. got it most of the way there. You can see it goes up about halfway. Okay, now I'll let that glue dry, and then I'll clean that up a little bit. There's a little bit sticking out, but I can clean that up, and then do some light blocking. Other side is a bigger gap, so I can probably use the same strategy and have to do less sanding to fill that in. And there's a gap not just along that seam there, but also the seam going across the back there. So I'll have to do something similar. Okay, yeah, I just did a little bit of sanding, and you can see that goes all the way in, so that should be fine. Okay, so I've got another strip in this gap here. Still got to do one on the top there. For this gap here, it's very wide at this end, then it tapers farther we go that way. So I've done the same sort of thing where I've got a piece of my strip styrene and uh, just sanded it down more towards one end to give it that taper. And this is the piece I've ended up with. Tapers as it gets thinner towards this end here. This is the thinnest end. And then I've also kind of tapered the back, the thicker end of it, because underneath that gap right there is the cylinder for the impulse engine, plastic cylinder inside there, and then there's a bit of glue and stuff right there. So the gap is actually not very deep at this end. So I cut that little setback in the thick end to account for that. So now, make sure I get it pushed all the way forward. That's got to go a little further. There we go. So that's pushed all the way forward, and then I can just push that down in, and it more or less goes in and fills that gap. And like I said, right here, it's actually, the gap is not very deep, so I can just fill that in with some putty as much as I need to there. So I'll go ahead and glue that in. There we go. It's filled in not too bad there. The rest of that gap is fillable with putty, and I'll check and see what light blocking needs to be done, if any. Okay, using the same technique, I've filled in the gap here and here on the opposite side. I'll probably have to do something there. That's a pretty big gap, though obviously not all the way up. The challenge here, though, is there's actually also a very big step down from this side down to that side there. There's a big step. So, not quite sure how I'm going to deal with that. It wasn't that bad when I was first putting it together and first glued it, the two halves together, but then it kind of, when I was putting pressure on things and clamping stuff, then it kind of shifted, and now it's a big step. So I don't think there's much I can do as far as flexing the model to clean that up. So I might just have to, I don't know, live with it, or just try and smooth that over with some putty, just make it like a ramp so it's not as bad. We'll see. All right, been doing a bit of seam work on this, mostly just on this front part of the model, on the main seam that runs around the front portion. And I've been doing a mix of using the Perfect Plastic Putty. I like this stuff because it's easy to work with, but not, it's not very robust. And so if you use it for large gaps or large places that need to be filled in, it can tend to crumble. And also when you're sanding it, sometimes you'll gouge out a big chunk of it, or just a big piece will flake off, and leading to just having to rework that section. So I'm thinking this is more useful for very small imperfections and small seams that need to be filled. And still trying to figure out the best way to do it. I've also got this Mr. Hobby, Mr. White Putty. I love that they name everything Mr. something or other. But it's a little more, when it dries, it's a little more robust. You can see I've kind of got some that I've worked on here off to the side, and this kind of more beige colored stuff is the Mr. Putty stuff, and it's really pretty resilient. I mean, it is brittle. When you put enough force on it, it will kind of break away and chunk off, but it takes a lot more force to do that than it does for this more wider stuff here. That's the Perfect Plastic Putty, and it's pretty fragile stuff. It doesn't take much to break that. So um, the drawbacks of it, though, is it develops a film really quickly. Like as soon as you squirt that stuff out, it starts to develop a film, so it's a little harder to work with. But also paradoxically, um, even though it develops a film quickly, it takes a really long time to completely dry. So I'll have a film over it, but then you can kind of push on it, and you can tell it's still liquid underneath. And so it takes quite a long time to dry. So it takes more time to set up. So where the Perfect Plastic Putty is pretty quick to set up. So I don't know. Still have to figure out, still working with it and figuring out what the right situations for each approach are going to be. And then, of course, there are times where the gaps are just way too big that no putty is going to be able to fill those without tons and tons of relayering and rework. I had that issue come up on the where this main seam comes across and ends right at the nose of the deflector housing. And so like right here at this little corner, and on the opposite side there, right there, there were the top half of the model was more rounded off right there. And I don't know, just when putting it together, they didn't come together nicely. And so I had to fill these seams around the side quite a bit. But then also that rounded off section was just a huge piece missing. And I knew if I just tried to fill that in with putty that it would just flake off and not hold up. So I had to actually just end up cutting some pieces of sheet styrene and just, shaping them to kind of fit in that wedge section. And then using plastic cement um, to, because it kind of melts, kind of dissolves the plastic a little bit. So it allowed me to kind of mold and shape that once it had kind of slightly dissolved those. And the results I'm actually really pleased with. I think once we get that primed, I think that's going to look nice nice and normal. Look how it's supposed to. So I'm pleased with those results. I also had to use some styrene to fill in this section back here. Right here, there's a seam right there where the this bulkhead that has the Bassard collector, that's all one piece, and it also comes down this corner, and the seam between that piece and the main hull is on that edge right there. And on this side, the two seams came together really nicely, and they're pretty much at the same level. There's a gap there, but I should be able to fill that in pretty easily with some putty and some light blocking. So I think that'll be pretty easy to work with. And I haven't done anything with that yet on this side, but on the other side, it did not come together nicely, and there was a huge step down from the main hull. It stepped downward, and then the Bassard bulkhead was there. So anyway, it would there's no way I would have been able to fill that in with a putty. So I ended up just getting some sheet styrene and just kind of cutting off little sections of it and filling it in, and it was almost just the right thickness. I did have to just sand a little bit off the back so that it would fit more or less flush. And I did a piece here, and of course, it bends down, so I couldn't just do this all out of one piece. So I did a piece here and then a piece here, basically more or less rectangular or kind of trapezoidal sections, and then finally one little piece right here. And there's a bit of a step there. I'm going to have to do some sanding and some putty work for sure, just to kind of fill in what's left over. But it's going to be a lot easier to work with since I put the pieces of styrene in than if I had not. So it turned out pretty good there. I'm pleased with that. But yeah, it's slow going. Like I said, I'm not very good at this stuff. I'm just kind of learning it as I go, figuring out what works and what doesn't work. And um, I'll do something and have to kind of try and sand it down, and I'll take chunks out and have to redo a little bit. Just kind of learning the techniques that give good results. So it is taking quite a bit of time, but I'm going to continue working on the rest of the way around, and then I'll hit it with some primer, and that'll help me see where I still need to do some work where those seams are not quite blended as smoothly as I like. But yeah, it's slow process, at least for me. Maybe it is for others too, but yeah, that's where I'm at. All right, I've done some more work on the seams at the front of the model here. Cleaned up the seams here where I had to fill in that step down right there. Filled that in with some sheet styrene and cleaned up those edges, did a little bit of light blocking, and did some rescribing of the panel lines in that area. I think it's looking a lot better now than it did before, and cleaned up the seams over here on this side. And so pretty much I think the front of the model is good to go, at least for the first pass of seam fixing. Got to hit it with the primer to be able to really tell how much more seam work needs to be done, how good of a job I did on the first pass. Now for the back side of the model, I've got started on that as well. Had another situation here where there was a step down and had to fill that in with some sheet styrene. I filled it with a one piece here because there's a bend in the curvature of the hull right there. And then also, I don't know why I didn't just continue going all the way. I think I didn't need to, but because it was definitely worse. The step down was worse here. It was a deeper drop on this end, and it got shallower and shallower until up here there really wasn't much of a difference between the original um, pieces of the hull between this piece and this piece here. And so I didn't really need to fill that in. And so I figured I'd just kind of sand to taper that. It ended up, being quite a bit of a drop there where that piece of sheet styrene ended. The step down was just too great there, so I went ahead and got, this is actually a thinner piece of styrene here than here. Here I used the, let's see what, oh, there we go, you can see. So I used the 0.02 on this portion right there. And then like right here, I ended up going with the 0.01 right here. Just because, like I said, it ended up being a bit of a step down. So I glued another piece there and then just sanded it until it was mostly flush. And so rather than trying to hide the, uh, the, the, the seam that I made by joining two pieces of styrene, I went ahead and just decided to embrace that and just scribe it as a panel line. And I did the same thing here as well, where that seam was. Now there are no panel lines there on the original studio model, but I figure, hey, maybe they had some battle damage or something, had to replace some panels there, so it works, right? Some head cannon. I cleaned up on this side as well. This side was fine. There wasn't a big step there, so I didn't have to do any filling in with sheet styrene on this side. Did have some, a bit of an issue here where there was a drop down, not enough to really fill in with styrene, so I just filled that in with some putty and did some sanding. We'll see how good that looks when I cover it up with primer. So I think the majority of the seam work is done at this point, or at least, like I said, the first pass of it. Now I didn't do, you can see I've done some light blocking here, but I didn't do any putty work along this seam or this seam here wrapping around to the back, and same thing on the other side as well, because I was actually looking at pictures of the studio model, and there's a piece of just like a raised strip that runs right there where that seam is. And I thought, well, this model, the original kit, doesn't include that strip, that little bit of detail. But I thought that would be really easy to add with some strip styrene, or just cutting a strip of that sheet styrene and laying it across there. And if I do that, that's going to cover most of this seam right here. It doesn't go all the way. It goes from about there, from about where, basically where that little vertical panel line is there. It goes from about there all the way over to about here. And if I just cover that up, I don't have to bother trying to fill that seam in at all. So I just left it. I did fill from here outward though. And then on here, there's actually a photo etch piece from that green strawberry kit that covers over most of this little piece right here, towards the front, but towards the aft, it doesn't cover that. So I did do some filling of the seams there as well. And then same thing on this seam, basically from here down and all the way around, wrapping to this side here. There's another detail of just a raised piece that is not on the existing model, but is on the studio model. So, and again, that would be really easy to cut some pieces like that out of the sheet styrene. So I decided I'm going to go ahead and do that, and that way I don't have to bother with trying to fill in these seams and smooth them out. So there's also, I noticed when I was looking at that, on this back portion here, there's a missing detail. There's kind of another raised detail, but it's a little more, has a little more detail than just like these strips here, where they're basically just little strips of plastic. Back here, it's got almost like a grid grill type pattern, similar to like these, although it's not as fine toothed as that is. It's more along the lines of like that right there, or in fact, if we look at the underside here where the model does include, it's, something like that. There's a strip of that sort of thing right here, and then on the opposite side. I might try to see if I can replicate that detail. That's obviously going to be a little more difficult than just, I can't slap some of that sheet styrene on there. I'd have to add some detail, maybe build it up with some cut pieces of sheet styrene, or maybe make it out of some thicker plastic and kind of cut and file down and gouge out some of those vertical stripe details. Not sure. We'll have to see. But, while I'm at it, while I'm adding those details, missing details, I might as well see if I can do the same for that missing detail. Let's see, on the back here, I did some seam work here. There was a bit of a step down between this gray piece is a separate piece that kind of caps the end, right, over the two halves. And there was a seam that ran along that portion right there. And so I did some putty filling in there where it stepped down. I think there is still supposed to be a panel line there, so I'm going to have to come back and scribe in on top of that when I'm done. But I did need to cover that little step between the two pieces, so I filled that in with some putty and did some sanding. I don't think I did a really good job there. I'm definitely going to have to do some follow-up work on that once I get that coated with fresh coat of primer. I think the defects will be obvious. I'll have to do some more work on that. I also did some work on this. This is a separate piece of the original AMT ERTL kit, and I'm not really sure what the point of that was, although underneath this part there's this big old scar, like a belly button from, I think, where they injected the molten plastic to mold this lower half of the hull. There was like a big scar there, so I guess they didn't have anywhere better to put that, and so they designed this piece to cover over that. But it was so poorly fitting. It was awful. Like, there was just huge steps, and like it had a different curvature than the rest of the model and the rest of the hull. And so, yeah, it was really bad. So I did a lot of sanding on the original part before I even placed it in here. I had to fill in with sheet styrene to fill some of the gaps that were in here. And then I went back in and did a whole bunch of putty around there and some sanding. It still doesn't look great. I know I'm going to have to do some follow-up work on that. I don't know if you can kind of see, it's got a pretty rough finish going on there. So I got it as far as I think I want to for the first pass. I'll hit that with some primer and see how bad it is, how much more work I need to do on that. So let's see. I think that's where I'm at. I'll go ahead and do those pieces of strip along there, those extra details, before I hit it with primer, just so I can get a good overall look. Oh, I also had to do a lot of filling in around these impulse engines because they were the little resin cylinders from the Green Starberry kit that went in there, and I had to cut out the holes in the original hull because this was all just solid filled in on the original kit. So I had to cut those holes out. Didn't do a great job. They were not perfectly round. There were some gaps that I had to fill, and the fit of those cylinders into the holes that I cut was not great either. So I did a lot of filling there, and I looked at the studio model, and there's essentially it's just flush and flat all the way down to where the opening is. I thought maybe there might be like a raised little edge there, but not according to the studio model pictures that I have. So I just sanded that flat, as flat as I could, filled in with putty, sanded again. There's some bubbles you can see in there. There was a lot of bubbles in my putty work. You have to get better at applying the stuff. It's tricky. There's so little working time on this putty. Again, just using this Mr. White putty stuff. There's so little working time on that I just have to work fast and end up getting sloppy and getting bubbles and stuff. So here's the other side. I filled that in with some cotton, just because I didn't want all the sanding dust getting down in there. But then the cotton fibers were kind of sticking out and getting in the way, so then I covered those with just some blue masking tape, just to kind of push that down in there and keep the cotton fibers from getting in the way. But yeah, need a little bit more work on there. I sanded that, and there's a bit of you can see there's a bit of an edge right there. It's mostly pretty flat, but in a few spots there's gonna need some more putty. I've got these helping hands that I use for electronics work, um, with these steel plate with some magnets that you can take these off and move them around to whatever's convenient. And I needed a way to hold on to the model while I was applying putty because I needed essentially two hands because there's so little working time. I used to just squirt the putty out onto a piece of masking tape and then use my tool to pick some up and then bring it over to the model and apply it, and then go back, get some more and apply it. But even the time it would take to squirt out the putty onto the tape, place the lid on the bottle, go in, pick up some putty, and bring it to the model to start applying it, in that short amount of time, it had already built up a film so that when I came and tried to apply it to the model, it wouldn't actually come off the tool. It would just, like, it would not stick to the model at all unless I kind of smushed it around and kneaded it essentially. Then it would start to stick to the model. But doing that introduces, I think, is one of the sources of those bubbles that get in there, is that kneading action. So I needed a way to be able to get the putty to the model as quick as possible before that film started building up. So I wanted to use both hands where I could just have the bottle right there next to the model and pull some pull some putty out of the bottle and apply it to the model immediately. But I needed both hands to do that. So I just decided to try and use these helping hands that I've got. And essentially I just kind of set it up something like this, where these two shorter ones in the front would kind of grip onto the front of the nacelles to keep it from sliding forward. And then uh, this these other two underneath I would just kind of adjust to get the angle so that the model would sort of set up something like that. And then I could go in and apply some putty. So I do need to put a little bit more on where the impulse engine is right there. So let me see if I can get the camera a little bit closer and you can watch and see me do that. Okay. All right. So I've got the camera positioned. Let's see if we can get some putty on there. I know I'm going to need some more for filling in those gaps. So hopefully you can kind of see. Oh, I shouldn't have squeezed that. Now it's in its auto extrude mode where it basically just comes out on its own. I don't know why these tubes always do that. Oh, it's so frustrating. It just keeps coming. Okay, so you can see like that film just builds up. It just appears immediately. And now I'm trying to work that putty to make sure it gets down into those cracks without building up bubbles. But it's opaque, so I don't know if there's bubbles in there or not. I don't know until I start sanding and they reveal themselves. But that's essentially what I do. Just pull the putty right out of the tube, and I have to kind of break through that film to get to the sticky stuff underneath. It'll actually stick to the model. But so I get why people like to use that perfect plastic putty. It's so much easier to work with, but it's just not as strong. And so there's limited places where it's a viable option. So done a bit more work on this. As you can see, I've started figuring out what I'm going to do with the stand. I'll show you that here in a minute, but I want to give you a quick update on what I did with the seams here on the edge, where I've got, I added some strips of the sheet styrene all right there, and then this one that's wider that wraps around the corner. And then I was able to figure something out here with the that bit of missing detail I was talking about that had kind of that those ridges. And oh, before we move on to that. So I got that strip there. So yeah, and then I just did the same on the other side. So yeah, so for this part here, what I was able to find was I was at the hobby store, and they've got like this display of different types of polystyrene sheet materials and tubes and rods and all kinds of stuff you can buy. And I just decided to take a look at what they had, and I found this stuff here, this metal siding. And it's just got those ridges, and I thought, hey, that's perfect. I just cut a little section of that, and yeah, I like it. I don't know that it's necessarily in exactly the same scale as far as those ridges go as the studio model, but it has the same effect. So I think it looks great. I like it. I decided to go with it. All right, another update just real quick on all the other edges. I think I've got the first pass done on all my seam work. It remains to be seen how that's going to look once I decided to go ahead and put a coat of primer on, at least just around the edges and some of these spots where I've sanded off, just so I can get a better feel for what that's going to look like when it's finished, and what it's going to reveal what additional work remains to be done for smoothing things up. And I know there's some places I'm going to have extra work to do. Talked about that weird little piece there. I know I'm going to have some work on that, but anyway, I'm getting ready to start doing to put the coat of primer on. I've masked off my clear pieces and other things that I don't want to get primer on. I put some little, um, just some little sticks. I just broke off some of this stuff from these cotton swabs to put in there. There's those holes for where those pipes go. I don't think that there would really be, if any paint overspray got into there, wouldn't really be a big deal, but I don't know. I figured, hey, those are the right size. I'll just put them in there, and then I just put a little bit of white glue on there um, just to keep them from falling inside or falling out. So, um, and then for these, I just actually just filled those with white glue. It works pretty good as a paint mask. Um, so I did that here. I didn't have to do anything on these because I've still got that wire that I talked about in there as masking. I never took that out. Oh, I did refill in these little pips in the middle, these tiny little holes that are supposed to glow. I don't want to get paint on those, so I just put some drops of the white glue in there to mask that off. And yeah, that should be just fine. Okay, so let's talk about what I decided to do for the stand. I was going back and forth on, I've got one of these like round bases from like a Polar Lights kit. This is actually my Polar Lights Discovery Enterprise. And I thought of maybe using this and then just getting another one for when I build the Enterprise. And that just comes with one of these nice metal rods that has the hole through, so you can run wiring through it. This wasn't quite the right size to fit that hole. It was just a hair too big, so I would have had to like grind down the edge on this to actually get it to fit into the hole. And I considered doing that, uh, but I also really like the stand that comes with this model kit, where it's got the communicator badge, Starfleet symbol, plus the logo Deep Space Nine. I think that's going to look good. I went back and forth between the two different stand ideas, and I decided I want to go with this. I like the way this looks. I think it's going to look cool when it's painted up with the logo and everything. So I decided to go ahead and go with this, and then just, kind of work with this part of it to see what I can do. And it essentially goes like this. Put it in there so you can kind of see And I like that it kind of tips the ship up. It's not parallel to the ground when you mount it in there. The ship is kind of tipped up a little bit, and I like that. I think it's a kind of a neat look. It's hard to get in shot here. Let me tip my camera back a little so you can kind of see that. Yeah, there you can see it there. I like the way that looks, and the only thing that I don't really like about this, well, two things is I have to figure something out special to deal with the wires, but also it's kind of wobbly, as you can see. It's it's very jiggly, but I mean it's okay. I'm going to put it on a shelf, and it's going to be displayed on a shelf, and once it settles down, it's fine. And it's pretty sturdy. It's not right now because it's not glued in. This does tend to kind of come loose and fall forward. But once that's glued in, it's pretty. I'm not worried about it tipping over. It's just the wobble that's kind of silly. But like I said, once it settles down, it's fine. So I can live with that. So now I just have to figure out something to do with the wires. And as you can see, I've kind of figured out a way to get the wires through the same hole as the stand. And let me see if I can pull that out a little bit there. I haven't glued it in or anything. It's just pushed in there. It's a tight fit, so it just kind of pushes in. But okay, so I decided to just untape the wires so I can get this off here. So you can see what I did. Okay, so wires are going. This is just the original hole in the model. I haven't done anything extra to that, change its size or anything. But the little post on this stand is kind of in a plus shape, you can see, or an X shape, depending on how you tilt it. And I figured that there's almost, as is, there's almost enough space in these little recesses where the wire could run through there and go through the same hole. Because, the circle is going to go all the way around this, and there's going to be kind of like where you can see where that little bit of black paint is right there. That's, there's a gap between the inside of the hole and this little recessed area on the post. And so I just decided to just drill that out a little bit. I just used my rotary tool to kind of grind that back a little bit. I might have gone a little too far there, just because there's not a lot of material left on this little section of the post. So I might have gone a little too aggressive there, but I think there's still enough meat that it shouldn't be a problem. I suppose if it becomes a problem, I can just glue it on the stand. I don't know that I'd ever need to get it off the stand once it's done, but we'll see. I'll not glue it, and then if it becomes a problem, I can glue it later. But anyway, so I just ran one for the positive, one for the negative, and then once I ground that in a little bit, then I just used a hand drill with a tiny bit to drill all the way through. And as you can see, that post is not centered on the pad. And I mean, that's obvious if you look at it here, but I didn't really notice how off center it was until I started punching those holes through, and now you can see. So that's kind of obnoxious. I might have to maybe grind out this little section here just so that the wire can kind of come back and run along. I don't know. I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to do with the wires yet. I could just run them along here and cover them up with something. But that's the side that you're going to see, right? Because the model faces forward this way. And so that's right in front and center. So I could maybe wrap them around the back and have them come down the back, or I could run them down on the inside. That's kind of what I'm thinking, is just getting them over this little lip here, and then running them on the inside of that. So that would be behind. Where you look at it from the front, then you wouldn't see them. So that's kind of what I'm leaning towards. But then once I get down here, I've got to get them through somewhere. I don't know, maybe run them back this way. And I can't. I don't think I can just go like straight down through this and down through the base because that's right where that comes together. And if we look at what's underneath, it's got this built up section here around the slot that holds it, right? And so I'd have to be drilling right through that thickest part of the material. So I might have to, I don't know, bring it back and then kind of go down through back here maybe, or just to the side a little bit. If it's small enough, it might not be noticeable. I don't know. I'm going to have to put some thought into what I want to do there, but I've got to get it underneath somehow. And I guess another drawback of this particular stand is that there's no room for batteries. I've got this battery pack that I'm using for testing. I don't know that I'll necessarily use this one for my actual, when it's finished, actually use this. I haven't decided yet, but obviously that's not going to fit. I suppose I could build this up somehow or like put it on a little box or something. Yeah, that could actually work. That could work. Or another thought that I had was to actually just put a USB connector like that in the stand, just like here or something. Or maybe even just have a little cord come out, like a little pigtail that comes out with the actual USB. It would be female, but a little USB that comes out like that. And that way I can just plug in a battery pack when I want to turn the lights on, turn it on for display, and then, I could even just reuse that battery pack for different models, unplug it, move it to a different model. Because, I mean, it's not like I'm going to have this thing turned on all the time. Just every once in a while when I want to turn it on and admire the cool little ship, then I can just plug it in, turn it on. I don't know. I have to put some more thought into what I'm going to do for the base there, or for the battery situation. But I have decided I'm going to use this base, so I'm going to work through all of the particular issues with the wiring and the battery pack. But I'll come up with something I like. So that's where I'm at with this for now. I think, next step is to just go ahead and get some primer put on here, and we'll go from there. Okay, so I've put a coat of primer around all the work that I've done on this so far. For this coat of primer, I didn't use the same actual Tamiya fine primer that I used before on the first pass, just because it's a spray can stuff, and I'd have to take it outside and spray it out there, but it's cold and humid out there, so I don't think that's a good idea. And I'm not going to do it inside because it's just way too stinky. So I just kind of made up my own primer, if you will, just from some white paint, just using the Tamiya XF2 flat white, and I just I mark it with a T and an R to just so I know future me knows that I've added thinner and paint retarder to that. So that's just the X28 thinner, and then the Tamiya paint retarder. It just keeps it from drying too fast as it comes out of the airbrush. So anyway, so I thinned and added the retarder to that, and loaded it into my airbrush, and just added a coat to it. So several coats anyway. So I did start doing some sanding. I looked it over and checked all of the seam work that I had done, and noticed a few spots that needed additional work, which I expected. And so I started doing some sanding on that stuff. I should have showed you guys before I did that, just so you could kind of see what it looked like before I continued work on it. But you know, some of the spots are pretty good. That seam, I mean, from far away you can't see that seam anymore. Maybe the tiniest little hint of the original seam there. Some of them are a little more obvious, I think. This one, where I actually had to do a lot of sanding, because there was just a huge, I don't know, ledge there. The two seams did not line up well. And same thing here. I started to do a little bit of sanding there. Need to probably do some more. Then I had to do quite a bit there. This stuff does seem to be a little harder to sand than the Tamiya Fine Primer from the spray can. It could just be because it is different paint, or it could be that maybe I just haven't let it dry long enough. I mean, it did dry for a few hours, and I would think for a flat paint that should be enough, but I don't know. That could be a factor in why it's having trouble sanding. I try to sand it, and it just kind of like bunches and clumps up and just gums up the sandpaper and makes it difficult to really get a nice smooth sand. But I don't know. We'll see as I continue on. But most of these seams turned out honestly a little better than I expected. Although some of them, I knew I was gonna have to do some work, and I can see that I'm going to. So from far away, that doesn't look too bad. Well, when it actually focuses, thank you, it doesn't look too bad. But then, when you look at it up close, you can definitely see it's rough. So I'll have to decide what I'm gonna do there. Uh, if if I'm okay with how it looks from far away, or if it's gonna bother me looking at it up close. We'll have to see. And there's a few spots where I'm gonna have to where there's bubbles. Those bubbles that were in the putty are really obvious, like right there. So I'll have to find a way to fill those in, whether it's more putty or the perfect plastic putty would be fine on that small scale. But it honestly turned out better than I thought it would. Yeah, overall not too bad. So I think I'll just go and clean up a few more of these like really obvious spots. Might do a little more puttying. I think I might do some more puttying on that edge. It's still kind of a pretty obvious seam. Um, but I mean, like these seams were those really awkward bulkhead pieces, and where I had to do the patching with the sheet styrene. Those turned out looking pretty good. I'm pleased with that. So yeah, I think where I just kind of made those just look like intentional panel lines. I think those turned out pretty good. That one right there was one where I'd added the sheet styrene to kind of fill in the step down, this area here, and then just added some new panel lines. But I think those turned out looking pretty good. I have not checked the light blocking. Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. Okay, that's looking great down in there. Don't see any light leaks there. Okay, I do see one right there. Let's see, I don't see really any along the seam on the nacelle. Some very faint ones where it's coming through the plastic, but those will be covered by paint, no problem. Okay, that looks pretty good. Just those few very tiny ones that will be really easy to fix. So yeah, not bad. I didn't mention before. I was talking about how I had masked off
different portions of the model before I started adding paint onto this to the seams and stuff. I didn't mention what I'd done to mask off like the blinky lights and the windows, and like those little red guys right there. Just blobs of white glue, and we'll see how that works. I mean, I don't expect it to be a problem, but I suppose with these windows where I did fill those in with the UV curing resin, hopefully I can get that white glue off of there without popping out the little window that I made. That remains to be seen. I think that's probably going to do it for this video. Like I said, I'll just do a little bit more work on a few of those seams that I'm not quite happy with. And then, maybe hit them with a little bit of paint just as kind of like a prime coat um, before I get to the base color. But that'll be the next step after I'm happy with the seams. Yeah, I'm excited to develop the color scheme on this and do the overall painting. That'll be fun. But yeah, that'll be it for this video. So thanks for coming along, and glad to give you an update on this. And we'll see you next time.